Hi, my name is Heather Perry, and I'm the Superintendent of Schools in Gorham. I'm working with the Maine Department of Education to provide some training for guest teachers across the state of Maine. First of all, let me take a moment and thank you for being willing to become a guest teacher in our public schools across the state. You're greatly needed and very much welcomed to be in our schools, and I hope that you find these trainings meaningful and informative. The first training I'm going to work with you on tonight is the FERPA Training, which is Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This act was passed in 1974 and is all around the confidentiality of student records. FERPA is a federal law passed in 1974 that ensures parental access to their child's educational records while also protecting those educational records from being shared with any other third party. What are educational records, you might ask? Well, they're any record that contains information directly related to a student that is maintained by an educational agency or institution or by a party acting for that agency or institution. That's a pretty broad definition, but it really can entail quite a few different things. And I know that when people think about educational records, they're probably thinking about files and file cabinets and those types of things. But in today's digital world, educational records can be far more reaching than that. So we'll get into what those mean here in just a moment, but educational records can be in any form. They can be handwritten, typed, or they can be in electronic format. When can you share educational records? Well, you can share educational records when a parent grants permission for those to be shared, or you can share that information when there is a legitimate educational interest. This means that someone needs this information in order to perform their professional responsibilities. More often than not, as a guest teacher in our schools, that's likely the area in which you'll have access to information, and you might need to share information with others in order to operate and to perform your duties. That's probably the one that you'll deal with educational records in FERPA the most, and one to be the most aware of. You can also share information when it's directory information. Now that's typically, as a guest teacher, this is not something you're going to be doing. This is something that most of our teachers are well aware of what directory information is. But as a guest teacher, probably not going to be sharing a lot of directory information with folks outside of the school. But just know that there is such a thing called directory information. It's defined by each school system in their policy, and it is shared publicly each year so that families know what directory information could be shared each year, and they have an opportunity to say no, that they don't want that directory information shared. But again, as a guest teacher in our schools across the state of Maine, not something you're likely going to be sharing or dealing with on a daily basis. You can also share information when there's an emergency situation, and then only with appropriate personnel. This you might run into as a guest teacher in our schools. For example, if there were an evacuation or some sort of a safety protocol that needed to be followed, and you needed to communicate information about students. Maybe there's an emergency situation in your classroom and you have to communicate that to a school nurse or to even an EMT that might be showing up to deal with the situation. In that case, it's very much okay to be sharing information about the student that's in your classroom when there's an emergency situation. But again, only when it's appropriate personnel. You're not necessarily going to then go home or go to the grocery store later on and tell the story of the student that was in your classroom that had a medical emergency. Probably not a good idea. But if there's an emergency situation, sharing it with the personnel that are dealing with that emergency situation is very much appropriate. You can also share educational records when there's a subpoena. But once again, as a guest teacher in our schools, not likely to deal with that particular one. There's a note over here on the side that says military recruiters do have a right to student names, addresses, and telephone numbers unless parents have denied directory information be shared. That's just something to be aware of. Again, not going to be something that you run into as a guest teacher in our schools. Perhaps, if I'm stretching it, if you're a guest teacher at one of our high schools, you might see that. But again, if you have a piece of information that I'm going to share repeatedly in these slides, is that as a guest teacher in our schools, if you have any questions about FERPA and what to do with a request for student information, that's when you pick up the phone and you call your principal, or even better, probably the administrative assistant in the school that you're guest teaching at, and they can help you to navigate these particular questions that you might have. But this is just kind of a baseline of information that hopefully helps you to understand what FERPA is so that you can have an operational definition of that and be able to know, at least to ask the questions. What are examples of educational records that should not be shared without specific parent permission? And these are things that you need to be really cognizant of as a guest teacher in our schools. So This is not an all-inclusive list. Other things might be on this list, but generally speaking, some things that you might run into as a guest teacher in our schools that you should not be sharing outside of our schools is student grades. Definitely do not be sharing that information. Student ID numbers or student social security numbers should not be shared outside of the classroom situation. Student disciplinary records definitely should not be shared outside of a classroom situation, especially the stories of what might have happened in the classroom after school. That's something you should not, as a guest teacher, be talking about or sharing. You should not share student health records outside of your classroom situation. And student images. Something to be aware of is that most schools have media release forms for sharing of student photos on websites or social media sites, but without that express written permission from the families to do that, you are not supposed to be doing that. So if as a guest teacher you take some pictures and you want to share those for the social media pages, great, share them with the principal who can then share them appropriately and make sure that there's permissions appropriate for that to take place. Please do not do that on your own personal social media accounts or anything like that, because that is educational record that should not be shared without explicit parent permission. Again, as a substitute teacher, just remember, you don't share grades with other students or adults, you don't share disciplinary information, and if you're even unsure, reach out to that admin with your questions. They're the people that can help answer that. What are not educational records? Well, directory information, which we talked about a moment ago, and that's defined by each school in their policies, what directory information is. Typically, it's like names of students so that you can use them in, athletes, pictures of basketball teams, and you can name the students, or in yearbooks, it becomes that sort of thing. That's directory information. Sole possession records, that's another form that you actually might interact with as a guest teacher. Sole possession records are records that are kept in the sole possession of the teacher and or in the instance of a guest teacher, the temporary substitute for that teacher. So you may be sort of like writing a note back from you to the teacher around how things went during the day. That's perfectly fine and acceptable because that's what would be called sole possession records. Those are fine and they are not considered educational records. They're often used to help memory aids or to communicate back and forth between guest teachers and the teachers that they're substituting for. But that's sort of a limited basis. If those records are then shared, let's say that you write a note to the teacher and then you share that same note with a teacher across the hall. That's no longer a sole possession record, and it then becomes a FERPA or educational record to be concerned about or to be aware of. So just, good practice is, write your notes back and forth to the actual teacher that you're guest teaching for. Guest teacher can write notes to you about what to expect for the students, and you can feel perfectly fine reading all of that. That is not educational record until the point at which it's shared with people outside of that. Then it becomes an educational record and subject to FERPA. Key concepts to think about when you're thinking about FERPA and to remember, okay? First of all, it is important for you as a guest teacher to know that parents do have the right to request and inspect any of their child's educational records. It's important for you to know that parents have the right to request to amend any record. That's not to say that you would have to actually deal with that, because you shouldn't. So if you get a request from a parent to amend an educational record, that's, again, when you're picking up the phone, you're calling the administrator or the teacher and letting them know, and they can be dealing with that particular thing. Parents do have a right to disallow disclosure of directory information. Again, not something you're going to deal with a lot as a guest teacher, but it's important for you to be aware of. Parents have a right to file a complaint, and that is something that they do have a right to do, and that's a complaint with a federal level of investigators that actually will investigate any complaint and come to a conclusion about that. It's important for you to remember that in matters related to FERPA, custodial and non-custodial parents have the same rights under FERPA unless specifically dictated in legal custodial documents that right does not exist or no longer exists. So custodial, non-custodial parents, you need to be thinking about communicating with all the parents in the situation with students. And again, not often that you're going to have to deal with that as a guest teacher in the schools, but it's important for you to sort of be aware of, sort of tuck that away in the back of your mind. And if you have a question about that, reach out to that administrator. It's important for you to know, especially if you're at the high school level, that the rights of FERPA actually transfer to the student at the age of 18. So when the student is 18 years of age, that educational record right becomes theirs, and it's something to be working with them on directly. Also, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind as a guest teacher across the state of Maine, Maine is a small town, and any town in Maine is a small town. So just be cognizant of that. When you're a guest teacher in the schools, just go about your business, communicate with that teacher and let them know what's happening in the classroom. But that's not necessarily something to be talking about over coffee the next day, or in the grocery store the next day either. It's really important to just kind of keep that information right in the classroom where it belongs, and then you're pretty well safe and don't have to worry much about FERPA if that's the rule that you follow. The other rule to follow: if you ever have any questions, reach out to administrators. They're here to help. All right. Well, that's it for FERPA. That's a pretty quick training. Hopefully you found that educational. You can find lots of information online, and I would encourage you to look at that. But again, as a guest teacher, if I were to just ask you to remember one thing about this quick training, it is, if you have questions about FERPA and educational records and what to do with them, or people that are asking questions about them, reach out to your administrator. And then number 2, just try not to tell stories about what happens in the classroom. Thank you.